It's tempting, isn't it, to look for that one document, that one moment of ultimate betrayal that brought the emperor to his knees. We imagine a smoke-filled room, a hushed conversation, a signature on a piece of paper that undid an entire empire. Our minds crave that kind of simplicity because it makes history neat and tidy. But the story of Napoleon's fall is anything but neat. The truth is far more shocking than any single pact. It involves a multitude of them. Some were written in secret ink, others sealed with a reluctant handshake. And the most powerful one was never written down at all. It was an unspoken, continent-wide agreement that Napoleon simply had to be stopped. To understand how that happened, we have to go back to a time when Napoleon seemed untouchable. What if the story you know about Napoleon's downfall is missing the biggest piece of the puzzle? We tend to think of one single event, one secret pact, that brought down the greatest military commander of his time. But the truth is, it wasn't a single pact. It was a tangled web of secret deals, quiet conspiracies, and backroom handshakes stretching from the palaces of Vienna to the frozen plains of Russia. So, let's unravel the agreements that really sealed Napoleon's fate. The Emperor at his zenith. The year is 1811. Napoleon Bonaparte is at the absolute apex of his power. At 42 years old, he is the master of Europe. From the coast of Spain to the borders of Russia, his word is law. The old monarchies have been humbled, their armies shattered. Austria, once the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, is now a reluctant ally, so much so that its emperor was forced to give his own daughter to Napoleon in marriage. Prussia is a shadow of its former self, dismembered and occupied. Coalition after coalition had tried to stop him, and each one was crushed by his strategic genius and the unparalleled might of his Grande Armée. At the treaties of Tilsit in 1807, Napoleon met Tsar Alexander, the first of Russia, on a raft in the middle of a river, not as an equal, but as a victor dictating terms. They forged a powerful alliance with secret clauses that carved up Europe and committed Russia to Napoleon's economic war against his most stubborn enemy, Great Britain. To anyone watching in 1811, the Napoleonic Empire looked permanent. So, what could possibly unravel all of this? It began not with a pact of war, but with a pact of economic strangulation, one of Napoleon's own making. The Pact of Economic Strangulation. The Continental System? Napoleon knew he couldn't defeat Great Britain with a conventional invasion. The Royal Navy owned the seas. So, if he couldn't invade Britain, he would suffocate it. This was the idea behind the Continental System, a massive, continent-wide embargo designed to cripple the British economy by closing every European port to its trade. It was an economic pact of war, forced on every nation under his thumb. The secret articles of the treaties of Tilsit were the cornerstone. Tsar Alexander secretly agreed to join the system and declare war on Britain. On paper, it was brilliant. Cut off Britain from its markets, and its government would be forced to sue for peace. But the plan had a fatal flaw. It hurt his allies more than his enemy. While Britain was damaged, the economies of Napoleon's allies were devastated. Ports like Amsterdam and Hamburg fell into ruin. Industries that relied on British colonial goods withered. The system bred scarcity, resentment, and a massive black market. Smuggling became a patriotic act. Even Napoleon's own soldiers often wore British-made greatcoats, paid for by the very smugglers they were supposed to be stopping. The biggest consequence was the strain it put on the Franco-Russian alliance. Russia's economy depended on exporting grain and timber to Great Britain. The Continental System was strangling the Russian aristocracy, the very people Tsar Alexander needed to stay in power. By 1810, he'd had enough and broke the secret Pact of Tilsit by reopening trade with neutral ships, a thinly veiled way to resume business with Britain. To Napoleon, this was a betrayal. It was a challenge to his authority. He felt he had to make an example of Russia, and that decision would lead him down a path to ruin. The Pact of Endless War the Spanish ulcer. While the continental system was poisoning his empire from within, another conflict was bleeding it dry. In 1808, Napoleon turned his attention to Spain and Portugal. Portugal was openly defying the continental system, and its ally Spain was inefficient. He struck a deal with the Spanish government to let his troops cross Spain to invade Portugal. But it was a trick. Once his armies were inside Spain, he turned on his allies, forced the Spanish king to abdicate, and put his own brother on the throne. Napoleon thought the Spanish people would thank him for bringing modern, enlightened rule. He could not have been more wrong. The people rose up in furious, violent rebellion. What was meant to be a swift political move became a brutal 6-year guerrilla war. It was a people's war, fought in the mountains and villages with ambushes and horrific atrocities on both sides. Napoleon had broken the unwritten pact of national sovereignty. The war became what he himself called the Spanish ulcer, a cancer that consumed hundreds of thousands of his best troops, drained the treasury, and gave Britain a foothold on the continent to wage war against him directly. It showed the rest of Europe that Napoleon wasn't invincible. The pacts of shifting sands, diplomatic betrayals. While French soldiers were dying in Spain, a more subtle web of betrayal was being woven in the courts of his own allies. No one played this game better than the foreign ministers of Austria and even France itself. After its defeat in 1809, Austria was forced into a new friendship with France, sealed by Napoleon's marriage to the Austrian Archduchess Marie-Louise. He thought this marriage pact secured Austria's loyalty. But in Vienna, Foreign Minister Clemens von Metternich simply saw it as a way to buy time, secretly rebuilding Austria's strength while waiting for the perfect moment to betray his emperor's new son-in-law. But the most stunning betrayal was happening right under Napoleon's nose. The man at the center of it was Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord, Napoleon's own former foreign minister. Talleyrand was a cynical, brilliant aristocrat who had come to believe Napoleon's boundless ambition was a danger to France. So, he started making his own secret pacts. At the Congress of Erfurt in 1808, while Napoleon tried to impress Tsar Alexander, Talleyrand was secretly meeting with the Tsar, telling him to resist Napoleon's demands. It was a breathtaking act of treason. For years, Talleyrand fed information to Austria and Russia, taking bribes and undermining Napoleon from the inside. He was betting on Napoleon's fall long before it seemed possible, patiently laying the groundwork for a post-Napoleonic Europe where he, of course, would play a leading role. The pact of internal betrayal, the Marshal's mutiny. If Talleyrand's betrayal was a slow poison, the final betrayal was a knife to the heart. By the spring of 1814, the game was nearly up. The disastrous Russian campaign had shattered the Grande Armée, and a massive coalition of Russian, Prussian, and Austrian armies was closing in on Paris. Napoleon, fighting with the last reserves of his genius, was still winning tactical victories, but he was strategically doomed. The defense of Paris fell to Marshal Auguste de Marmont, one of Napoleon's oldest comrades. But Marmont, like the other marshals, was exhausted by endless war. He entered into secret negotiations with the Allied commanders. Without Napoleon's knowledge, he made a deal to march his army corps to a position where it would be surrounded, forcing its surrender. This defection opened the gates of Paris and made further resistance impossible. When Napoleon heard the news at the Palace of Fontainebleau, he was devastated. Marmont's name became so infamous that his title, Duke of Ragusa, is said to have inspired a new French verb in folklore, raguser, meaning to betray. Marmont's deal was the final straw, but he wasn't alone. A few days earlier, Napoleon's other top marshals had confronted him. He wanted to fight on, but they refused. In a tense showdown, Marshal Ney reportedly told the emperor, "The army will not march. The army will obey its commanders." This was a mutiny. It was an unspoken pact of abandonment that forced Napoleon to sign his first abdication. The catalyst, the Russian winter. All these pacts, the failing economy, the war in Spain, the diplomatic betrayals, the war-weary marshals were like piles of dry tinder. The spark that ignited them was the invasion of Russia in 1812. Driven by the Tsar's defiance of the continental system, Napoleon marched east with over 500,000 men. He expected a quick, decisive battle. Instead, the Russian armies just retreated, scorching the earth and leaving nothing for his army to live on. The capture of Moscow was a hollow victory. The city was set on fire, leaving no winter quarters. The long retreat began, pursued by the Russian army, and the brutal Russian winter, the Grande Armée, dissolved. Starvation and frostbite reduced the world's most magnificent fighting force to a frozen, starving rabble. The Russian campaign shattered the myth of Napoleonic invincibility. The sight of his power being humbled not by an army, but by geography and weather, sent a shockwave across Europe. For wavering powers like Prussia and Austria, this was the signal they'd been waiting for. The time for secret pacts was over. It was time for open war. The real pact, the Treaty of Chaumont and the coalition. This brings us to the real pact, the one made against Napoleon. As he reeled from the Russian disaster, his enemies finally united with a single purpose. This was the Sixth Coalition, and this time it was different. They would fight until Napoleon was utterly defeated. This final, unbreakable alliance was formalized in the Treaty of Chaumont in March 1814. In it, Great Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia bound themselves together, each pledging to keep 150,000 men in the field, and not to negotiate separately with Napoleon. Britain, the financial powerhouse, backed the alliance with massive subsidies to keep the armies fighting. The Treaty of Chaumont wasn't a classic secret pact, but it contained secret articles and represented an ironclad, public agreement to see the war through to the end. It institutionalized the consensus that peace in Europe was impossible as long as Napoleon was on the throne. This was the true force that brought him down. Not one man's betrayal, but the combined will of a continent that had learned the only way to beat Napoleon was to act with the same unity he once commanded. Faced with this overwhelming force and the betrayal of his marshals, Napoleon abdicated at Fontainebleau in April 1814 and was exiled to the island of Elba. So, what was the secret pact that sealed Napoleon's fate? The question itself is a trap. The hunt for a single moment of treachery distracts from a more fascinating reality. There was no single pact. There was the pact of economic warfare that backfired. There was the broken pact of sovereignty in Spain that drained his empire's strength. There was the pact of duplicity, engineered by men like Talleyrand from inside his own government. And there was the pact of abandonment from his own marshals. But the ultimate pact was the one he never signed, the Treaty of Chaumont, the pact of Europe against him. It was this web of miscalculations, betrayals, and alliances, not a single thread, but the whole tangled mess that finally brought down the emperor. His fall wasn't the result of one secret deal, but the consequence of a decade of them, proving that even the greatest of men can't make a pact against the will of an entire continent and expect to win. If you found this deep dive into the fall of Napoleon fascinating, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more complex stories from history. And let us know in the comments which historical secret you'd like us to unravel next. Thanks for watching.